if the war can be a broken bar. In the quaint town of Krovy Barvinok, nestled against the western edge of Ukraine, Natasha Ivanovna lived a life of quiet dignity. Her skin, weathered by years of tending to her garden, bore witness to the harsh winters and bountiful summers that painted the land. Her eyes, a piercing shade of blue, mirrored the resilience of the sunflowers that surrounded her cottage. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun, a reminder of the discipline she had learned from her mother. The distant rumble grew louder, shaking Natasha from her tranquil morning routine. She had heard such noises before: a soldier's convoys, the occasional artillery fire, but this was different. This sound grew in intensity, a persistent drumbeat that seemed to vibrate the very earth beneath her feet. She knew what it meant. The war with Russia had been simmering for months, and now it was knocking at her doorstep. Her heart racing, Natasha hurried to gather her things. She had prepared for this moment, as one does when the shadow of conflict looms large. She packed her bag with warm clothes, a few precious photographs, and her family's ancient recipe book, a collection of handwritten pages that contained the essence of her heritage. The smell of bread from the neighboring house wafted through the open window, a stark contrast to the metallic scent of fear that now hung in the air. The town's sirens wailed, a shrill cry that pierced the once peaceful silence. People rushed into the streets, their faces a blend of panic and resolve. Natasha locked eyes with her neighbor, Pavel, his usually jovial face etched with concern. With a solemn nod, they agreed to meet at the designated shelter. The thunderous approach of war was now undeniable. The townsfolk hurried through the streets, their footsteps echoing like a somber procession. Natasha clutched her bag tightly, her eyes darting to the horizon where dark clouds of smoke began to rise. The realization that this could be the precursor to World War III was a heavy burden, one she had hoped never to bear. But as she took her place in the line of refugees heading west, she also felt a fierce determination. This was her land, her home, and she would do whatever it took to protect it. The shelter was a grim concrete structure, a relic of the Cold War days when fear of annihilation was as common as the changing seasons. As Natasha descended the stairs into the dimly lit room, she was greeted by a cacophony of whispers and sobs. She searched the sea of faces for Pavel and spotted him at the far end, his strong arms holding up an elderly woman who could no longer stand. The sight of his kindness amidst the chaos brought a brief warmth to her chest. The shelter's walls were lined with cots, each one holding a story of lives interrupted by the cruel hand of war. Children clung to their parents, their eyes wide with terror, while the older folks sat stoically, as if they had seen this all before. Natasha found a spot next to Pavel and set her bag down. They shared a look that conveyed the unspoken understanding of the gravity of the situation. Pavel's hand found hers, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that together, they could weather the storm. Days turned into weeks as Natasha and Pavel, along with the others, lived in the cramped confines of the shelter. The air grew thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. The rations were meager, but they were grateful for each mouthful. They listened to the radio, the static-filled voice recounting tales of battles and diplomatic standoffs, each piece of news more alarming than the last. The line between Ukraine and the rest of the world grew thinner with every explosion that resonated through the night. One evening, as Natasha lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, she heard a commotion at the shelter's entrance. The heavy metal door creaked open, and a young soldier stumbled in, his uniform caked with mud and sweat. His eyes searched the room, and when they found Natasha, he rushed over, his voice trembling with urgency. "Ma'am, your son," he said, gasping for air. "He's alive." Natasha's heart leapt with hope, but his next words sent it plummeting again. "He's hurt. He's been asking for you." Her breath caught in her throat. Her son, Sergei, had been fighting on the front lines. The last she had heard of him was a letter, months ago, filled with bravado and patriotism. Now, she had to decide whether to stay in the relative safety of the shelter or risk the perilous journey to find him. The thought of her only child, her reason for living, in pain and alone, was too much to bear. She made her decision swiftly, squeezing Pavel's hand one last time before she rose and followed the soldier into the night. The outside world was a symphony of horrors, but she had to find her son. The path ahead was fraught with danger, But Natasha Ivanovna was not one to back down from a fight. The war had come for her town, and now she would go to war for her son. The journey was a blur of chaos and despair. They dodged through the decimated streets of Krovy Barvinok, the once charming cottages now nothing more than skeletal shells. The acrid scent of burning rubber and metal filled her nose, making her eyes water. The young soldier led her through back alleys and overturned cars, his eyes darting to the skies for the feared drones that could rain death without warning. Natasha's heart pounded in her chest, not just from fear but from the thought of what she might find as the end of this treacherous path. When they reached the makeshift medical tent on the outskirts of the battlefield, Natasha's breath hitched. The sight of her son, pale and bandaged, brought a rush of emotions she had not allowed herself to feel for too long. His eyes fluttered open at the sound of her voice, and she could see the relief wash over his face. He was alive, but his injuries were severe. The doctor spoke in hushed tones about operations and recovery times, but Natasha could see the doubt in his eyes. The medical supplies were scarce, and the fighting grew more intense by the hour. Natasha took her son's hand, her own trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "You will fight," she whispered fiercely. "You will not let this war take you from me." Sergei nodded weakly, squeezing her hand in return. His strength was waning, but she knew that he heard her. In that moment, Natasha made a silent vow to do whatever it took to ensure that her son's sacrifice would not be in vain. If it meant confronting the enemy herself, she would stand as a shield for her child. The war had come for her home, and now it had come for her son. But Natasha was ready to be the storm that the enemy had not anticipated. The days in the medical tent were a blur of pain and hope. Natasha watched over Sergei, her hands never leaving his side. The doctor's visits grew less frequent as the hospital grew more crowded. The line between life and death, a precarious tightrope that stretched thin. Her thoughts drifted to the recipes in her bag, the ones she had hoped to pass down to her grandchildren. Now, she wondered if she would ever get the chance. The war had stolen so much already, but it would not take her son without a fight. And as Natasha held her son's hand, she knew that she was not alone. The spirit of Ukraine was in every face around her, every whispered prayer, every tear shed for a loved one lost. They were all fighting for the same thing: their home, their families, their very existence. One night, as Natasha dozed in her chair, the tent was shaken by a deafening explosion. The ground trembled beneath her, and the screams of the injured grew louder. The doctor rushed in, his own face etched with fatigue and despair. "We have to evacuate," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The enemy is closing in." Natasha looked at Sergei, his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She had to save him. With a newfound strength, she picked up her son and followed the doctor into the cold, dark night, their footsteps joining the symphony of war that seemed to have no end. The evacuation was chaotic, a river of humanity flowing westward, desperate to escape the jaws of the advancing Russian forces. Natasha stumbled, her body aching from the weight of her son and the bag slung over her shoulder. The air was thick with dust and the acrid scent of gunpowder. The distant rumble of tanks grew closer, and the skies above them were lit by the flashes of artillery fire. She whispered words of comfort to Sergei, her voice a lifeline in the chaos. They reached a convoy of military vehicles, and Natasha begged the soldiers to take them to safety. The men looked at her with tired eyes, but they knew the unspoken bond of a mother's love. They found a small space in the back of a truck, and she laid her son down as gently as she could. The engine roared to life, and they lurched forward, joining the exodus from Krovy Barvinok. Natasha clutched her son, her eyes never leaving his face, willing him to stay alive. The hours stretched into an eternity as they bumped along the rutted road. The truck was filled with the injured and the lost, each person clinging to what little they had left. The radio in the cabin crackled with reports of the escalating conflict. The words "World War III" were uttered, and Natasha felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. This was not just her fight anymore, it was a battle for humanity itself. When the truck finally came to a halt, Natasha stepped out into a landscape scarred by war, her eyes searching for a glimmer of hope amidst the destruction. The medical facility they had arrived at was a hive of activity, a stark contrast to the quiet dignity of the cottage she had left behind. Doctors and nurses moved swiftly, their faces a mask of determination. The doctor who had led them here took Sergei from her arms, and Natasha felt a piece of her soul go with him. She watched as they wheeled him away, his eyes still closed, his body so small and fragile. The doctor looked at her, his expression grim. "We'll do what we can," he said before disappearing into the fray. Natasha took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the retreating figure of her son. In the corner of the tent, Natasha found a quiet spot to pray. She thought of her garden, the smell of the earth after rain, and the taste of the sunflower seeds she had picked with Sergei when he was a child. These memories were her bastion, her strength. As the night deepened and the cries of the wounded grew more distant, Natasha's anger grew. This war had stolen her son from her, but she would not let it take her spirit. With a renewed resolve, she stood and walked back into the fray, her eyes now filled with a fierce determination. If she could not fight on the front lines, she would do so here, in the hospital, for every soldier who needed her, for every mother who had lost a child, and for Ukraine. Her days grew into a rhythm of pain and hope. She helped where she could, offering comfort, cleaning wounds, and fetching supplies. The medical staff grew to rely on her, and Natasha found purpose in her new role. She had never felt more alive than when she was bringing a bit of peace to those who had seen the face of hell. The news grew grimmer with each passing day, the world teetering on the brink of a global conflict. Yet, Natasha's focus remained sharp, her son and her country. One evening, as Natasha brought a tray of food to the patients, she overheard snippets of conversation that sent a chill down her spine. The enemy was advancing, and the hospital was in danger of being overrun. The doctor, seeing the fear in her eyes, took her aside. "You must go," he said, his voice firm. "We can't guarantee your safety here." Natasha knew he was right, but the thought of leaving Sergei in this place of chaos was unbearable. Yet, she knew that if she stayed, she might not be able to protect him. With a heavy heart, she gathered her things and whispered her goodbye to her unconscious son, placing a gentle kiss on his forehead. The journey west grew more perilous with each passing mile. Refugees crowded the roads, their eyes haunted by what they had seen. Natasha walked among them, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The land around her was scarred with the scars of war, the once vibrant fields now a patchwork of charred earth and twisted metal. The sirens wailed in the distance, a mournful song that seemed to follow her wherever she went. But Natasha walked on, driven by the fierce love for her son and the unshakable belief that she would find him again. The world was falling apart, but she would not let it claim her spirit. As Natasha reached the relative safety of the next town, she heard the distant rumble of war machines drawing nearer. The air was charged with tension, and she knew she had to move quickly. She found refuge in a church, its ancient stones a silent witness to the wars that had come before. There, she met others like her, mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, all searching for loved ones, all fighting for a future free from fear. They shared their stories, their pain, and their hope. In their shared grief, Natasha found a spark of camaraderie that ignited a fire within her soul. The days turned into weeks, and Natasha's search for Sergei became a quest. The news grew worse. The war's reach extending across continents, threatening to engulf the globe. Yet she refused to give up. Each sunrise brought new information, new rumors of his whereabouts. Her heart was a compass, pointing her toward her son. And as the world around her burned, Natasha Ivanovna became a symbol of Ukraine's unyielding spirit. Her journey was not just for Sergei, it was for every life torn apart by the madness of war. With each step, she carried the weight of her country's hope, her love a beacon in the dark. The nights grew colder, and Natasha's body grew weary, but she pushed on. The lines between war and peace, victory and defeat, blurred into a landscape of suffering and loss. Yet, amidst the ruins, she saw signs of life. Children playing in the streets, a couple sharing a stolen kiss, a group of soldiers laughing around a fire. The human spirit, she realized, was as resilient as the sunflowers that once grew outside her cottage. It was this resilience that had carried her this far, and it was this resilience that would see her through to the end. One fateful day, Natasha received a message, scrawled on a scrap of paper passed from hand to hand. "Sergei," it read. "Alive, Lviv." Her heart leapt with hope. Lviv, the city that had become a bastion of Ukrainian resistance, was still holding out against the relentless tide of the Russian onslaught. With renewed vigor, Natasha set off once more, her path now clear. The journey to Lviv was fraught with danger. Checkpoints manned by desperate soldiers grew more frequent, their eyes searching for any sign of weakness or deceit. Natasha's heart pounded in her chest, but she held her head high, her eyes never wavering from the road ahead. She had become a master of concealing her fear, her calm demeanor a shield that had served her well in the chaos of war. Her bag, now almost empty, held only her son's favorite shirt and a recipe book, the latter now stained with her tears and the dirt of her travels. Upon reaching the city, Natasha found a place to rest in a basement that had been transformed into a makeshift shelter. The air was thick with the scent of fear and hope, a potent mix that fueled her determination. She approached the local resistance leader, a stoic man named Konstantin, and shared her story. His eyes softened at the mention of her son, and he promised to help her find him. "We fight for our families," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "And we fight for our land." With Konstantin's guidance, Natasha infiltrated the hospital where Sergei was rumored to be held. The once gleaming halls were now stained with blood and the marks of battle. She moved with a stealth that belied her age, her gardening shears now sharpened into a weapon. The hospital was a microcosm of the war, a battleground of life and death, where every corner held a potential threat or a glimmer of salvation. As she searched room after room, Natasha's mind was a whirlwind of memories and nightmares. Each face she saw a reflection of the innocents caught in the crossfire. Finally, she found him. Sergei lay in a bed, his body a tapestry of bandages and tubes, his eyes open but unfocused. He was alive, but barely. Natasha's heart clenched in her chest. This was not the son she had sent to war, not the man she had raised to be a beacon of strength. The doctor, a young woman with a tired smile, told her that his injuries were severe, that he might not make it through the night. Natasha felt the world crumble around her, the weight of her fear and anger were almost too much to bear. But in the quiet of the hospital room, Natasha found her resolve. She whispered to Sergei the stories of their family, of the summers spent in the garden, of the laughter that had once filled their cottage. Her voice grew stronger, and with each word, she wove a tapestry of love and hope around her son. The doctor watched, amazed, as color returned to Sergei's cheeks, as his eyes focused on Natasha's face. The sound of footsteps grew louder in the hall, the enemy closing in. Natasha knew she had to act. She made her way to the hospital's supply room, her heart racing. In the dim light, she found what she needed, a medical kit and a set of crutches. With trembling hands, she bandaged her son's wounds as best she could, her own injuries from the journey now forgotten. She helped him to his feet, his arms slung over her shoulders, and together they stumbled towards the exit. The city was a war zone, a symphony of gunfire and explosions. But Natasha's love for her son was a force that could not be stopped. They made their way through the streets, dodging bullets and ducking for cover. Each step was a silent prayer, each breath a declaration of her unwavering will. As they reached the outskirts of Lviv, Natasha saw the Ukrainian flag, touted but still flying. The sight filled her with a fierce pride that surged through her veins. They had made it. They were free. But she knew the war was not over. It was a battle that would be waged for years to come, a battle that had already claimed too much. With Sergei in the care of the resistance, Natasha made a choice. She could not rest while her country was in peril. So, she picked up a rifle, her gardening shears now replaced by a weapon of war. Her eyes, once filled with the softness of a mother's love, now held the steel of a lioness protecting her cub. The training was quick and brutal, but Natasha had known hard work her whole life. The skills she learned in the field served her well, and soon she was a formidable fighter. Her days were now spent in the trenches, her nights in the company of her newfound family of fellow soldiers who had also lost loved ones to the relentless conflict. They shared stories of their homes, their hopes, and their fears, their voices a whispered chorus in the night. The sound of gunfire had become a lullaby, a constant reminder of the price they paid for freedom. In the quiet moments between battles, Natasha would sit with Sergei, his eyes now clear and focused. He spoke of his pride in her, his voice filled with a newfound respect. They talked of the future, of the life they would build when the war was over. Natasha had found a new purpose in her fight, and not just for her son, but for all the sons and daughters of Ukraine. The news grew more dire. The world had indeed plunged into the depths of a third world war. Yet, Natasha remained steadfast. Her love for her country had grown stronger than the sunflowers that once stood tall in her garden. The war had taken much from her, but it had also given her a reason to live, to fight for those who could not. One evening, as Natasha stood guard, she heard a sound that didn't belong to the symphony of war. It was a soft, mournful melody, carried on the wind. She recognized it as a folk song her mother had sung to her as a child. It grew louder, and she saw a group of soldiers approaching, their faces lined with the same resolve that had etched itself onto hers. They were from her old neighborhood, men and women she had known all her life. The sight of them brought tears to her eyes. They had come to fight alongside her, to protect what was left of their home. As they joined forces, Natasha felt a spark of hope. The enemy was strong, but together, they could stand against the tide. The war had taken much, but it had also forged bonds that would never be broken. The people of Krovy Barvinok had become more than neighbors. They were a family united by a shared destiny. The battle for Lviv raged on, the city a bastion of resistance against the overwhelming might of the Russian forces. Natasha and her makeshift platoon held their ground, each bullet and explosion a testament to their unyielding spirit. They fought not just for themselves, but for every Ukrainian who had suffered at the hands of the invaders. And as the night grew darker, Natasha knew that the price of victory would be steep. But she also knew that the love she bore for her son and her country was a fire that could not be extinguished. The fighting grew more intense with each passing hour, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the cries of the fallen. Natasha moved with a grace that belied her age, her rifle a natural extension of her arms. Her eyes, once filled with the softness of a mother's love, now gleamed with the fierce resolve of a soldier. The line between life and death grew thinner, and Natasha felt the weight of every decision she made. Yet, she pressed on, driven by the image of Sergei's smile and the promise of a future free from fear. The dawn brought a brief respite, the first light of day revealing the extent of the destruction. Buildings that had once stood proudly now lay in ruins. The streets a tapestry of shattered glass and discarded munitions. But amidst the rubble, Natasha saw a flash of yellow and blue, the colors of the Ukrainian flag. It was a small victory, but one that filled her heart with a fierce determination. As the sun rose, the city's defenders took stock of their losses, but also of their unbreakable will to stand firm. The days blurred into a relentless cycle of fighting and rest, Natasha's skills growing sharper with each passing moment. Her son's condition improved, his spirit bolstered by her unwavering presence. Word spread of the woman from Krovy Barvinok who had become a beacon of hope in the darkest of times. Her story inspired those around her, turning despair into a burning desire to fight on. And as the world watched, Natasha and her comrades stood firm, a bastion of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. One evening, as Natasha cradled her rifle, her eyes stinging from the dust and smoke, she heard a new sound cutting through the cacophony of war. It was the sound of children's laughter, a sound that seemed impossibly out of place amidst the chaos. Looking up, she saw a group of kids playing a game of tag in the ruins of what had once been a playground. The sight brought a smile to her face, a reminder of what they were fighting for. These children were the future of Ukraine, and she would not let them down. The war continued to escalate, with the fate of the country hanging in the balance. The international community debated sanctions and military intervention, their words echoing hollowly in the ears of those on the front lines. Natasha knew that the war would not be won by politicians in far-off lands, but by the people of Ukraine, who had known the taste of freedom and were unwilling to let it go without a fight. In the quiet moments between battles, Natasha would sit with her fellow soldiers, sharing tales of home and loved ones. The darkness outside was a stark contrast to the warmth that grew within their ranks. They had become a family, bound not by blood but by the shared experience of war. Each loss was felt deeply, each victory celebrated with a fierce joy. One night, As Natasha sat by the campfire, her thoughts drifted to the recipes in her bag. The comforting aromas of her kitchen seemed a world away, but the memories they brought were a balm to her weary soul. With a sudden resolve, she decided that no matter what the future held, she would not let the enemy take her culture. She would keep the flame of Ukrainian traditions alive, for Sergei and for all the generations to come. The war raged on, and Natasha's legend grew. Her name became a rallying cry, a symbol of hope in the face of despair. Yet, she remained grounded, her thoughts never straying far from her son and the home she had left behind. With each dawn, she felt the weight of her responsibility, the knowledge that her actions could shape the course of history. And as the world watched, Natasha Ivanovna, the sunflower of Krovy Barvinok, continued to stand tall, her spirit unbroken by the storm of war. The battles grew more fierce, the enemy more relentless. Natasha's days were spent in the trenches, her nights haunted by the faces of those she had lost. But she found solace in her newfound family, their shared pain and hope a bond stronger than any she had ever known. They fought not just for themselves, but for every Ukrainian whose life had been upended by the conflict. One morning, Natasha was called to the hospital. Sergei had taken a turn for the worse, his body weakened by infection. She held his hand, whispering the words of the folk song that had been her lullaby, her voice a gentle breeze in the chaos of the ward. His eyes fluttered open, and she saw the recognition in his gaze. For a moment, it was just the two of them, a mother and son in a world that had gone mad. The doctor's prognosis was grim. They needed supplies, medicine that was scarce and heavily guarded by the enemy. Natasha knew what she had to do. With a heavy heart, she kissed her son's forehead and promised to return. She gathered a small team of soldiers, each one a reflection of her own determination. They set out into the war-torn night, their mission clear, to bring back what was needed to save Sergei and the others who lay in the hospital's care. The mission was fraught with danger, the enemy's grip tightening around the city. They moved through the shadows, Natasha's gardening shears now a silent weapon of war. The sound of her son's labored breathing echoed in her ears, driving her forward. They found the supply depot, a treasure trove of medicine and bandages, and Natasha felt a glimmer of hope. But as they made their escape, they were spotted, and the chase was on. The streets of Lviv were a minefield of bullets and shrapnel, the air a symphony of fear. Natasha's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But she was not alone. Her comrades moved as one, their eyes fixed on the prize, their hearts beating in time with hers. They fought with the ferocity born of desperation, each step a testament to their love for their country. As they approached the hospital, Natasha's heart swelled with pride. They had done it. They had brought hope back to the beleaguered city. She raced to Sergei's side, the medical supplies in hand, her eyes never leaving his face. The doctor worked tirelessly, Natasha assisting, her hands steady despite the tremor of exhaustion. And as the infection began to recede, Natasha allowed herself a single tear, a silent prayer of thanks. The war had taken so much, but it had also given her a purpose. To fight not just for her son, but for every life snuffed out by the darkness. With each victory, Natasha's resolve grew stronger, her love for Ukraine a beacon that could not be extinguished. The battle for Lviv was far from over, but Natasha knew that as long as she had breath in her body, she would stand firm, her spirit a bastion of light in the face of the relentless enemy. In the hospital, Natasha's days were a blur of treating the wounded and comforting the dying. Her recipe book had become a symbol of home, a reminder of the life she had left behind. She would read the recipes to the patients, her voice a soothing balm to their troubled minds. The smell of fresh bread and borscht filled the ward, bringing a moment of peace to those who had known only the stench of war. The nights were the hardest. The darkness outside was mirrored in the eyes of those who lay in the beds, their dreams haunted by the horrors they had seen. But Natasha was there, her hand a gentle touch, her voice a whisper of comfort. She had become the mother of the resistance, her love and care a lifeline for those who had lost everything. And then, the unthinkable happened. The enemy had breached the city's defenses, and the hospital was in their sights. Natasha knew that she had to get the patients to safety. With a heavy heart, she gathered her strength and led them through the war-torn streets, dodging bullets and bombs. The journey was fraught with danger, each step a testament to their will to survive. As they stumbled through the ruins of Lviv, Natasha clutched her son's hand, her eyes never leaving his face. The city she had once known was unrecognizable, the places of her childhood now a battleground. But she knew that this was not the end. As long as there was breath in her lungs, she would fight for her country, for her son, for the future of Ukraine. The convoy of medical vehicles grew smaller with each block, the sound of warfare growing louder. Natasha felt a surge of fear, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce determination. She had come too far to lose everything.